Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Dave Frank. We are talking the news of the day. And our first topic is going to be Biden's speech. Was this a justified speech against the potential for fascism in this country, or was it partisan manipulation? And in the speech, he basically talked about how the MAGA Republicans are a threat to democracy. And we can go into some of the details and the rest, but he's been slammed for it by a number of Republicans. Jim Jordan said it was a pathetic old man speech or something like that, and Mitch McConnell said it was deliberately, partisan when this should have been more of a State of the Union type speech rather than a campaign kickoff speech. He shouldn't be partisan when he's bringing up these issues, that type of thing, and that's kind of been repeated by some moderate to conservative commentators, but other people are saying, first of all, this is campaign season, and second of all, these are based on everything we've talked about on this show. These are real concerns. These are people who are in place who do not recognize that the election was won by Biden in 2020, but on top of it, the candidates that are running under the MAGA banner scream fraud every time, win or lose. They scream that they've lost because of fraud or that they won despite a fraud. It's like becoming like the thing for anybody who is at least a MAGA person new to politics, and we just don't see the Republican mainstreamers who are in power standing up to them, other than the people we've talked about, Kinzinger and Cheney, and some figures like Will Kristol and the Lincoln Project, I think. But I'm going to let you in here, Dave.
Sure.
What do you want to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different, again, I think I'm using this metaphor a lot lately in our conversations, but there's a lot of different sort of prisms at which you could view this through. So, the main ones, typically you would think style, substance, impact, which we could get into all those pieces, but you did a pretty, I would argue, really good job rather of just giving the context. And it was a campaign speech. It's campaign season, campaign kickoff. So then the question is, some of the critics said, well, you had the Marines there. You were, at attention with American flags at the Independence Hall, and that, so there's some degree of criticism on whether he took advantage of his position as president to frame the whole speech before we even get to the speech. But the truth is, I think former President Trump did something similar by having a campaign speech in the Rose Garden, or people have made that point. So I think that line of etiquette and decorum has been a little bit blurred lately, especially with the stakes so high. So that in big picture, I don't think some of those criticisms I don't think really hold much water. But just in terms of style, I think it was for lack of a better word, engaging. And also relatively effective at throwing down the gauntlet, which he intended to do. So I think in terms of the purpose and the intention, I think it checks all the boxes. We could talk actually about impact and maybe more subtle criticisms, which it did receive from both the left and the right.
Sure, we can do that, but he knew that the Republicans were going to complain about it. He would have been disappointed if they hadn't. That was the whole point, is to bring this up, because this is an attack playing on the whole Mitch McConnell thing of the quality of candidates that he's been trying to back off of, but he can't, and Rick Scott won't let him alone, or well, it started to finally. But these are the MAGA candidates are different. Now notice, they're even trying to moderate a little bit. Like Oz said that he would have certified the 2020 election. Is that going to hurt him? Is it going to help him? He's way behind in the polls. I've already called a race, so we all know what's going to happen, right? But but he's so in terms of effectiveness, his polls are going up. I mean, pardon me, his approval rating is going up, but it was going up before the speech, so it's really
Mhm.
hard to say whether or not the trajectory was in any way affected by the speech. But he did give springboard for Democratic candidates around the country to to make use of it and to point out that this is the issue, one of the issues, and tie it in with the loss of choice, with now with a judge who's, we'll talk about in our second segment, making rulings that the legal field is criticizing. But in terms of it being effective, well, the Republicans probably shouldn't have given it as much attention as they did.
Yeah.
I think that was a mistake on their part.
Yeah, I think we're just in this heated moment where we talked. I don't know if it was a week or two ago about the whole Dark Brandon, where
Mm-hmm.
where the Biden team took the meme that Let's Go Brandon, which was a criticism of him and his ineffectiveness, and they turned it around and from their perspective made it a strength by linking him with Dark Batman. So the lighting, for example, was this red lighting in a dark background. There was this sort of like I said, this entertaining quality to it, to a certain extent. But that doesn't take away from the substance, which, as you alluded to, or even outright said, there's a concern. Like there is actually, when from the perspective of the president and from the perspective of his party, there is a real concern. There is a concern for the nation, for the future of the nation, when it comes to people who would not acknowledge the peaceful transfer of power, but more importantly, for the people who would then resort to violence when the peaceful transfer of power goes against their interests. So
Yeah.
if anytime you lose, you're going to call out violence. That again, from the perspective of the president and from all of his supporters, his party, and hopefully for anybody thoughtfully paying attention to what happened on January 6th, this is a real concern. So in terms of the mission, the statement of what he said and how he said it, I think he hits the mark. The reason I've used a lot of couched and reserved language is because this was a really blunt instrument to say Trump and the MAGA Republicans, because in a way there's a lot of group affiliation. Some people are being brought into the guilty side of the house, I would argue, and this is what a lot of people from the left are saying too, is when you frame your critique so broadly, without precision, you are alienating people in a way that you don't like it when you get alienated. So for example, if you say you're a liberal socialist, you're a liberal communist,
Right.
you're a bleeding heart liberal tree hugger, it's like actually some people that are left leaning or progressive are thoughtful on issue by issue. So there was very limited, I would argue, or this is what I've heard argued rather, that there was very limited precision in it, which gave the GOP an opportunity to just push back and sort of rally those troops, those same people that were shakeable, that could be independents or could be vote for Republicans only out of tradition, not out of reflection. Any of those people that would, for example, join the Lincoln Republicans that you described, right? The Lincoln
Right.
Project. Those are folks who are like, look, we have been Republican conservatives our whole lives, but our convictions tell us we can't vote for Trump because of what he's done. ...
Mm-hmm.
So potentially, that's the hammer. That was the point, I think, of the blow, was try to cleave that make that split in the Republican Party obvious, and win over moderates.
He did clarify later, I'm not talking about all Republicans, just
Yeah.
MAGA Republicans, and that
Yep.
is a broad term as to what it means. I mean, Cheney and Kinzinger both voted against the first impeachment, and because of what they claim to be the outrage. There's a great Frontline documentary I saw last night. I'm forgetting the title of it, but it's a 2-hour one, and it begins with the all of the presidents, all the losers of presidential elections, going all the way back to 1932, congratulating their opponent and saying we need to move on, and then contrast to him when they point out that he claimed fraud when he didn't win an Emmy Award, right? I mean, that's his history, that's who he is, and but fascinating documentary. A lot of the stuff wasn't a surprise, but there was footage I didn't know existed.
That's pretty neat. And just to pick up on this point before we get too much further along, the fact that Trump was already saying that there was going to be fraud back in the summer before the election.
Yes.
And he was saying the only way I lose, and I can't even remember the exact quotes, but it was basically saying like they're going to try to steal it. They're going to try to steal it. Like he was dropping those hints long before the election. There was a strategy in play, a political strategy in play. And so just that was just reaffirming what you said. But just to get back to how effective is this speech really going to be? Arguably minimally. I would suspect not a whole lot of people were really moved by it necessarily in that sense. But it was important. And I've seen speeches before that they stand on their own. Like President Obama was really good at that. If there was an issue that came up he wouldn't gain new ground necessarily, but from a rhetorical perspective, it was important to see, because that's what we have, this bully pulpit. That's one of the president's main powers is to just make a stand.
It was to stigmatize some of the Republican candidates. And that's and that's its effectiveness. I mean, he actually has done pretty well on his Labor Day speech. There was a heckler, and he immediately showed a contrast between what happens at a Trump rally. He's telling the guards, "Oh no, let him go, let him go. Everybody has the right to be an idiot, right?" And everybody laughed and all of that. I mean, he does seem to be is floating in his sneakers, lately with the stuff. He's not fumbling, in speeches. If he's making any gaffes, they're not making big headlines, does seem to be doing well. And again, the price of oil dropped again today. It said the gasoline and oil are at the lowest prices since January. It's there really isn't too much going wrong for him right now. The jobs report last Friday was perfect in the sweet spot. Still showing expansion, so maybe a recession could be, in theory, be avoided, or at least not be really negatively impactful in a big way, and yet not so many jobs that it's spurring on inflation. All of a sudden, the Fed, talking, well, maybe we don't have to jump up 3/4 of a point. Maybe it'll be a half or a quarter of a point, right? And so they can do that because that does show that the job market is not necessarily cooling, but not overheated, possibly the way it was.
And I'll agree with you that an awful lot does seem to be going his way. We won't get into the details about the economy. I just feel that it's a little bit off where I was thinking we go today. But in reality, like you said, he things are definitely going the president's way in many ways in terms of policies and the economy for sure. But there's two other elements, like just again, because before to add. One is you talked about hecklers and how he handled hecklers in a past speech. This one, there was somebody outside the Independence Hall with a bullhorn who you could hear throughout the speech actually, and he did make a comment of it, basically saying like, look, we're not going to let that interfere with what we're doing here today.
Right.
So I thought that was a good sort of dismissal.
A lot better than getting into the face by face and calling him an idiot like he did in that one during the primary campaign.
Yeah. And the other piece, another like subtle element of the speech, I think, was that he did like I was saying, the critics were saying it was a little bit of a arguably too blunt of an instrument to claim Trump and the MAGA people, but to the extent that he did try to mitigate that, which he did several times throughout, saying, look, there are good Republicans out there that I work with, and and his track record, like he's even said, I saw that he gave the or I don't know if it was the eulogy, but he gave a eulogy for Senator Strom Thurmond, who was one of those Dixiecrats who was a segregationist, and basically his position is, look, that we were cordial and we were professional with each other. So from a modern lens, where you say, anybody who's a friend of somebody like that must be terrible. In reality, he was saying, there's a degree. This is the Senate. We're talking about comity is the word of the day, that you can deliberate. This is supposed to be the highest deliberative body in the first democracy, the first modern democracy. And the Senate should be above all of that, which it's obviously clearly not. So I think his senatorial legacy, he tried to tap into that and say, like, we work across the aisle. This is what we must do. So there's slight knocks for maybe not quite embracing being the president of the entirety of the country and making sure you go through extra steps to reach out to those people who might misinterpret you. But beyond that, he did take some measured steps in that direction.
Yeah, he did, but this was intended. He wanted to go. He wants the offensive on. He wants the Republicans on the defensive. And right now, we've discussed this. All of the mainline Republicans, we know they hate Trump's guts, but they can't stand up to him. If they do, they get primaried or otherwise, reduced. I mean, I almost felt sorry for Ted Cruz watching that documentary last night. I mean, here he was fiery. I don't want, do we want our kids hearing that when he's talking about his wife and then later his father being, associated with Lee Harvey Oswald and all this crazy stuff, but he got booed and heckled at the convention when he was trying to say that we need to be more oriented towards governing and not craziness, and everybody's screaming at him, endorse or get off the stage, and some of them are even calling for violence against him. So you've got the Republicans that won't stand up, and at a certain point that's got to be an issue too. The Democrats have to make that an issue.
Absolutely.
Just now, the Justice Department has filed a motion in the Southern District of Florida to unseal a search warrant and property receipt relating to a court-approved search that the FBI conducted earlier this week. That search was of premises located in Florida belonging to the former president. The department did not make any public statements on the day of the search. The former president publicly confirmed the search that evening, as is his right. Faithful adherence to the rule of law is the bedrock principle of the Justice Department and of our democracy. Upholding the rule of law means applying the law evenly, without fear or favor. Under my watch, that is precisely what the Justice Department is doing.
Related subject, a little bit. I mean, Trump is, of course, having the legal troubles. They continue. There's actually talks that, Rob Barr says that he today said that he thinks that the evidence justifies a prosecution, that we're at that point, which is very interesting thing for a Republican guy who used to be in his cabinet to say, even though he cooperated with the January 6th committee. But right now, the proceedings are in front of a judge that Trump appointed, and she is acting the part. She hasn't had any high-profile cases before, and she is granting a special master to review the records and determine whether or not there are any records that might fit in with either attorney-client privilege, or executive privilege, and the rest, and without providing a whole lot of guidelines as to what the special master would be looking for. And the whole one of the points that needs to be made is that there is probably going to be an appeal. And all the legal scholars are saying that this decision to allow for a special master, somebody who does not have security clearance to be viewing top secret documents, whether or not that's sustainable by law, and we'll find out.
Yeah, so I would just say, big picture, just for context, from what I've heard and read, the application from Trump's legal team itself was primarily a political document that was really limited on legal grounds that they tried to, and to a certain extent, almost non-existent legal grounds. And so they were just kind of seeing what would stick. And the Presidential Records Act that they sort of alluded to, this executive privilege claim, it was I've heard it described as novel, inaccurate, and filed in the wrong jurisdiction. So this judge that you mentioned, her name is Judge Eileen Cannon. She was nominated after Trump had already lost the presidential election, and then pushed through, arguably railroaded through by the Senate. And so just on pragmatic grounds, not to it's not up to me to decide if there's corruption involved, but there's a corrupting element here. In that Presidential Records Act, because the jurisdiction for Presidential Records Act claims is the District of Columbia. So she knows this as a federal judge by her embracing that. Well, I'm not saying there's an executive privilege claim here, but I just want to make sure that the former president has an opportunity to make this claim. So by ignoring that wrong jurisdiction part, that's a tell to a little bit. But just last, since we're 30,000 foot view. She also put in an injunction to not look at these documents until after they're reviewed, the ones that were confiscated in August, and that was not even asked for. What was asked for was a special master. So while it's theoretically in the power of a judge to do this, it's not. Professional opinion may vary, but it seems like the consensus is that this was far out of line with protocol from any other sensitive cases. But net, it's primarily, this was an overtly political, sympathetic delay tactic at best.
I've been trying to research because I'm going from memory as I'm getting older of law school, and I remember there was a case in the 1950s. I don't even remember the specific context, but a judge was being asked to look over, not a special master, but a judge was being asked to look by one side to look at the documents to determine whether or not they would be relevant and discoverable. I don't know if it was a criminal defense case pertaining to espionage or not. This is getting to be almost 30 years now, and so I definitely want to find it, and I want to report on it next time around. But when the judge and when the national security people came in and said, Judge, nobody is supposed to look at those, not even you. Even you do not have the jurisdiction to look at those. And of course, the judge is like, what? You're telling me I don't have the jurisdiction? And so he overruled and was going to do it. And the appellate court shut him down, said, no, you don't get to do it. You don't have security clearance, so you don't get to look at these. And I don't remember what eventually happened with the case, but it would seem like, since these are top secret documents, we're hearing now rumors that one of them pertained to the nuclear capabilities of another country. We're not told about that, but this is very serious stuff. And so, if that was a precedent, and we only discuss appellate court decisions in law school, so if that was a precedent, then that precedent would certainly contradict a special master. I mean, it's one thing for the judge even, but when they didn't even allow the judge to look at this stuff in the old one, for her to be talking about a special master, do they get somebody with security clearance? I mean, but would that be fair to Trump? To have anybody who actually has security clearance, in terms of if we're saying he's got the right to do this. I have a hard time seeing how this decision stands once it gets to the appellate court, unless they run into a panel of mega judges.
So well, that's interesting. Like, there's two pieces. That last little line, you threw me for a loop. I have to respond directly to that. President Trump successfully did appoint a very significant portion of the federal judges on the bench. So that's not an insignificant part of what's happening here. So that's one thing. I don't, again, I'm not impugning anybody or anything like that just based on their affiliation with him or appointment by him rather. But the truth is that's something in the back of folks' mind for sure, especially under the circumstances. But so two things. To be sympathetic for a second, devil's advocate here for Trump. Some of the his supporters have said, well, look, if you look at the documents that were seized, they include things that really shouldn't have been seized. It's not just the federal documents that he shouldn't have had.
Right.
They also seized other things that were personal.
Passport.
Yeah.
Items of clothing, apparently, but they were stuff that were in the boxes. This guy was throwing everything together in the boxes.
But also medical documents, tax documents, accounting documents, and so that's one thing that you could say arguably, okay, well, the filter team, the DOJ filter team, has gone through things, and if they in fact have already cataloged everything that they're allowed to do, that a special master's task would be a short list. It would be. So then the question is, well, let me go to the devil's advocate part two, is that Judge Cannon made the claim that, this is a quote, the stigma associated with the subject seizure is in a league of its own. Basically saying, like, look, this guy was the president. You're saying he did all this awful stuff. You're seizing things from his house. Let's just take a cooling off period and let somebody else decide if any of these documents are outside the scope of what should be covered by the by this process. So in a way, like I said, being sympathetic, those two things stand on their own. Yeah, of course you don't want your personal items seized. And of course, yes, the president is an extraordinary case. That's about it for devil's advocate here, because in reality, it's probably the case from everything I've read so far, everything I've seen, everything that has come out, in part because of leaks, by the way. Like Merrick Garland has said that we don't typically, Justice Department does not leak as a practice. There have been an awful lot of leaks already on this. So that's
like the nuclear one. That was that went to either the New York Times or Washington Post, and
I saw, yeah,
and that was timed right after, right as probably a time to put pressure on the judge, saying, "Do you really want to do this?"
So it's unprecedented, like hard stop. Like it's, if you take a step back, yes, there is a concerted effort to charge him with or possibly indict him for things that on their face seem open and shut, and that if you don't have a legal argument, you're going to make a political argument. The political argument was made by the Trump team. It was responded to by a sympathetic judge. But like you said, I'm gonna agree with you here that this is probably going to end up, when the next judge looks at all of these elements on the merits, it seems pretty clear that you can't have these documents outside of their play. Like some of those, the ones that are supposed to be those specific documents that were supposed to be viewed only in a secure room, that category of document, there's often, very few people in the world that are even allowed to see them or talk about them.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that's what the critics of this decision are really kind of hanging their hat on in frustration and to a certain extent disgust. It's universally seen that it would create a precedent where this person, former president, is treated, if not above the law, in a unique way that is arguably not just unprecedented, but not. It shouldn't be this way.
Well, it
shouldn't stand.
Yeah, I mean, and we're talking about here, documents where they've got. We saw the photo last week, I believe, of the top secret folders, and they're not sure what was in them and if they even have everything, right? Is there going to have to be another raid? I mean, that's that's really what they've got to discuss here, is because as to what's in there, and Trump, until now, hasn't had a lot of success because he has arguably a very bad legal team, or did. I think people are coming in now that have a little more gravitas in this thing. But having him say, I declassified everything, had a standing order to declassify, that was a huge mistake, apparently, because it basically admits that he has classified documents. Right?
Yeah.
The documents were intended to do. So it was almost like a confession. So did that come at the advice of his attorneys to say that? Or did his attorneys tell him, don't say stuff like that, and he went ahead and did it anyway. This is why the other reason a lot of people don't want to represent him is he just says what he feels like. It was planted. It was one of his stuff. Oh, the FBI is planting stuff, and there's that meme of Columbo saying, "Sir, if these were planted by the FBI, then how did you declassify them?" Right? I mean, it's just and all of his former people are contradicting him, saying we never heard about any declassification, and he's like saying, "Well, I don't have to." There was actually a process for declassification, and there are certain documents that even the president cannot declassify. He's got some real problems here. Can he stall the process until after the election? Is that what he's trying to do with the special master? I don't know. It seems like he's just dragging stuff out and keeping it in the headlines, and I imagine a lot of Republicans are starting to resent that too, but they won't say anything.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of delay. That seems apparent because they might arguably fight over any given document. So they could drag out appointing the special master, selection process. They could, any given page could be fought all the way through the process. Right. So it's really a delay tactic. But getting back to what you said about Trump's advisors and things that they're saying publicly, I thought former National Security Advisor John Bolton kind of said it best, where he said, if you're treating this from a rational perspective, you're giving him too much credit. And he literally is just a hyper ego character who goes through life doing whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And then he just kind of hopes through his brash, braggadocio, whatever the word is, that he'll brush aside challenges and keep moving forward. But
he doesn't have Mitch McConnell to protect him in this context. There's nothing they can do. They're scrambling for a response. They don't know how to respond at this point. McCarthy made the mistake of calling the FBI and the Department of Justice out. That we talked about that the first week, and whereas Mitch McConnell and a lot of others were smart enough to keep their mouths shut. And then all of a sudden Friday, when the word espionage hits the headlines, McCarthy went quiet. And even today, he's not saying a whole lot, and he's in jeopardy. He's probably going to face challenges to his speakership, even if the House flips. And as you discussed last week, and we've discussed, they are favored to flip the House, but it's not a guarantee.
Right. And again, not to belabor this point, but I think it's really important to just kind of say one more time here that apparently the law itself is really clear cut, and that if they've documented that the National Archives went in and tried to get documents, made a first pass, they made appeals. They were told that we've given you everything, but they knew that there was things that they didn't give them, and then so they took an extraordinary, unprecedented step, and the
attorneys who signed off on that, by the way, are probably going to be facing being disbarred. I mean, that is a very serious thing to sign something like that. Now, it may be their defense is they didn't know, they just trusted their client, but then you don't sign the affidavit. That everything has been there unless you know.
Yeah. And then so now where does that leave him? Well, Trump has had a hard time getting a lawyer at this point. People have said he needs a lawyer to serve as, quote, a quarterback, somebody to channel the legal arguments, channel the legal team, direct and navigate the process. The lawyer that stepped up most recently, and unfortunately his name's escaping me right now, and I just I can't recollect it, but his firm has already scrubbed his name off of all of their website documents he's produced, legal research that they had posted, or public documents that were available to the public on their website have been pulled down. They don't want to be affiliated with him. And this is a firm that's known to represent DeSantis in the past. So it is a strong Republican, very conservative / right-leaning firm. But the idea that they do not want to be affiliated with Trump. This is not, and that's a tell. That is a tell of his true legal jeopardy. If accredited, respectable Republican legal firm scrubbed this guy from their record as soon as he took the job. So that's a bad sign for him.
I think he was in trouble when he burned Giuliani for the fees, but that's, who wants to represent him in that? This is an
Yeah.
expensive thing too, not a guarantee. All right. Well, that we'll be back talking about that. We know.
Friends, I'm proud to greet you from Ukraine, from our capital, city of Kyiv, a city that is under missile and airstrikes from Russian troops every day, but it doesn't give up. And I have the honor to greet you on behalf of the Ukrainian people, brave and freedom-loving people who for 8 years have been resisting the Russian aggression. Those who give their best sons and daughters to stop this full-scale Russian invasion. Right now, the destiny of our country is being decided. The destiny of our people.
Okay, final segment. We haven't talked about the Ukraine war in a long time, but there have been some interesting developments. After the Ukrainians repulsed the attack on Kyiv, the Russians completely abandoned that whole region of that and decided to focus on the east and consolidating the south. Since then, they'd been making very slow progress, but steady progress advancing east. But then because the Ukrainians have been fighting well, making really good use of the javelins, the stingers, the British and Swedish equivalents of them all, they were given the HIMARS, as they're called, the long-term, very accurate rockets, the long range, and they've been using them to take out bridges, to explode ammunition dumps and other supply dumps. Apparently, they've been using them in a very strategic way, probably coordinating with other military intelligences, including the West. And it's been very effective. And it's not only slowed the offensive, but then it looks like Ukraine may have kind of pulled the thing, made a big deal about saying we're going to march down and retake Kherson, the first major city to fall to Russia very early in the war. And they do indeed have an offensive going on, but they also now, of late, have an offensive going on at Kharkiv and down in the Donetsk, and now they're starting to retake cities that they did. There are now Russian soldiers who are complaining that they're not getting the support, that they really should just pull the soldiers out and nuke Kyiv and the other cities. I mean, really advocating this, and these are intercepted phone calls, being made and they've been translated to English. And you're starting to see a lot like what happened with the Battle of Kyiv and the initial Battle of Kharkiv. The open sources that get the footage directly from soldiers and that aren't necessarily official are showing a lot of abandoned hardware, armored vehicles, and the rest on both the Kherson front and the Kharkiv front. This is an indication that maybe the morale is slipping again, and the Russians don't want to fight this to the death. Meanwhile, there have been attacks. There have been attacks. We're not quite sure if they're missiles or partisans in Crimea, as far south as the Sevastopol base. Several attacks, one by a drone that didn't do a lot of damage, but it got through whatever passed for air defenses down there, and revealed that there's a partisan. So things are basically going well, and I'll let you expand that. It at least is being reported for Ukraine at the moment. And if they retake Kherson sometime before winter falls, that's going to be very difficult, and for the Russia to kind of put a positive face on it. And I noticed that there was a press conference yesterday in which the spokeswoman, forgetting her name, for Biden, the new one, was asked, well, are you going to demand that Russia be considered a sponsor terrorist state? And all she would say is, we're anticipating negotiations. We want to keep the door open for that. I think even Putin if he loses Kherson and loses any more ground in the east, has to consider that if they wait much longer, they're not going to be negotiating from a position of strength at all.
Well, thank you for that setup. Very detailed, and it really does the gravity of the situation. You did it justice. There's a massive, we're talking tens of billions of dollars of armaments are being used, but it's in a very small space, and so it's an awful situation down there in the Crimea and the east, southeastern part of the country. What I've seen, just to sort of reiterate some of what you said, is that the progress on the front line is real, but the way they're describing it is really small counteroffensives that where they'll cut off some of the Russian troops from their supply lines, isolate them, and then basically take prisoners. So and it's only small villages. It's nothing that significant. But when you combine that with what you described as the ability to make attacks pretty deep within Russian-controlled territory, whether it's special forces or drones or however they're making that happen, is obviously that's all classified.
Let me just ask you, because I think you know a little bit more about the military than I do, but I'm not a military expert at all. But do you think that the Kherson offensive was a feint, and now that they're opening up pressure all along the east, where Russia pulled forces in order to guard Kherson to avoid that symbolic loss, and now they've got weaknesses and pores all along the front, as the Ukrainian military with their new weaponry chips away? I mean, this is kind of what I'm reading, but I just don't know how to evaluate it.
And I don't intend to be speculative and speak outside the scope of things that I know with certainty, but just again, from what limited stuff that I've read, there's very limited, we're talking about tens of billions, but not a lot of people. So Ukraine's first priority is defense. And they're not overextending in anything offensive. Just stopping the Russian offensive was a moral victory plus, because their ability to defend themselves, that opened up this broader sort of economic global conflict against Russia. If Russia could really be held to account at home for their decisions that Putin made in Ukraine, and so rather than treat it like a battlefront, treat it like, well, how do you hurt the guy who's swinging punches at you? Well, if you burn down his house, he's going to go home. So there's definitely a larger economic issue. But to your point, my understanding is that the offensive is very minimal. Like it's very small, very minor. But very targeted. So it costs Russia a ton of money for each tank that you can take out with a really, one missile, and as long as there's more missiles coming in than tanks rolling in, now you've got, Russians that aren't particularly motivated compared to Ukrainians who are highly motivated. Yeah,
they're abandoning the tanks, the BMPs, whatever those things are. They're abandoning them on a big scale now, both in Kharkiv and probably the east as well, and in Kherson. And maybe their strategy isn't even to march into Kherson to forcefully retake it, but just demolish their morale and have a lot of Russians almost kind of surrendering. I mean, they're cut off from Crimea right now because of the bridges being taken out by the long-range weapons. And so, and I get we should turn it to the United States, but I'll let you respond to my question here. But is this going to be something that Biden is going to push as a success for the election this time around?
So with my belief, my understanding as of now is that the goal militarily is a freeze, is a stalemate. But with those incursions that we described, one sign that it's been successful is that the referendum election was postponed. Yes. So the security situation in the Russian-held territories is not Russian-backed local leaders aren't confident enough to hold a referendum at this point.
The collaboration with leaders are being taken out.
Exactly.
Either by partisans or by long-range weaponry.
Yes. So with that in mind, I know you want to pivot to the U.S. I think it's important just because I'm talking about, the difference between the tactical military issues that are happening that we've already described versus the bigger war. People don't like to use the word proxy war, but Putin is basically saying, that he's willing to use energy as a weapon. So the West has been trying to prepare to blunt that weapon. And with that in mind, President Biden is now asking for $13.7 billion more for Ukraine, which is part of a $47 billion emergency supplemental spending bill. And a lot of that bill is COVID and monkeypox. That's the emergency that they're pointing at.
Yes.
But nearly a quarter of it is for Ukraine. And a big chunk of it is also for the U.S. to resupply ourselves for the things that we've been sending to Ukraine. And that means starting up, like some of these missile plants, for example, aren't even operational. They're assembly lines. So we are operationalizing some weaponry with some of this money so that we can restock our own supplies.
Yes.
And that would put the number at $58 billion allocated to Ukraine, mostly equipment and ammunition, but also direct budgetary support to finance their governmental operations, which means that right now the United States is backstopping the Ukraine's finances as they seek more investment. In fact, Zelensky rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange yesterday. So we are talking about a long-term ally developing that relationship. The other countries that are putting a lot of money in are the Baltic states and Norway, and to a lesser extent, UK and Poland. So we're starting to see, much more than the rest of Europe. Europe is really going to defend itself from this energy aspect that's about to hit. It's cost so far. This conflict has already cost the West over $1 trillion, but it's really hammering Russia's economy in a big way. So I expect and then I'll pass over to you. I expect that the bipartisan support in Congress for financial, and military aid for Ukraine will continue. Because of the it's a Cold War that's happening right now, and United States through its sanctions regime and through its its economic muscle in the markets is going to try to affect Putin's behavior for things that he's gotten away with for a long time, which is more than a peace. That's more than just a peace with Ukraine. I think that's what's at play here.
I mean, if there's some indications that Putin is going to come to the table, and realizing that he better do it now because if all of a sudden the front, passes Kherson and all of a sudden goes into Crimea, he looks weak. So has this been geared towards showing that Putin's military is totally ineffective, and if he has to start admitting it at home, maybe he negotiates? I mean, I think that if the war were to end before the election, seems unlikely, but if the war were to end before the election, Democrats would clean house. I mean, everywhere. That would be a big deal. I mean, that would have so much impact all across the thing, even though this has been bipartisan. There have been enough Republicans, taking bizarre positions on this, particularly on Fox News but even some of the people in office, even like Hawley, he's thoroughly discredited since the footage, so it's this is another thing. But Biden isn't the type to brag about it. So how about something like this? He'll brag about other things, but not this. He's old school that way. But how do they sell it as a Democratic success?
And it's. You mentioned, and I think it's probably not the case, unfortunately, but you mentioned that if there was a true success, if there was a true, petition for peace coming from Putin, then that would be there's no way to spin that any other way than a success. But and I wish it weren't so. What I'm about to say, I wish it weren't so. But in the beginning, if there was any talk at all about a peace settlement, the Ukrainians and the United States signaling through Ukraine or vice versa, the bottom line, and the UK too, Boris Johnson also, that Ukraine wasn't really willing to give up territory right now.
Right.
So with that in mind, that would mean Russia would have to fully capitulate and fully withdraw, which doesn't seem like that's going to be possible either.
They could win. They could actually win things for it. Like, for instance, let's say they gave up Crimea, but had access to one or two of the Black Sea ports. that could be a compromise, that they have a leave or given on a business relationship, or 20-year contract or 40 or whatever, that they have direct access to it. If that was the big issue economically for Russia, that's something that they could do, and they could say, yeah, we don't need the land, we need the ports, right? And he could save face and say, yeah, well, that's what we really wanted, and claim victory, because he's got enough people that are willing to believe anything he says, apparently. So it just but if they talk about it that way, yeah, a good compromise there. I mean, because that's what they really want. They don't have more mortar ports, right? So what if they got that? Sevastopol is right there, on the other side of where Russia is. If they had some type of arrangement, if they tried to negotiate it before, they might have gotten it a lot easier, right? But he just thought he could have it, and now he could lose that, entirely. I mean, he said before that if the Ukrainians did any attacks on Crimea, he was going to treat it like it was Russian soil, and was going to use targeted going after leadership in Kyiv. Well, if he had the capability, he would have done that already. And they're attacking Crimea all the time now. Just there's been like a dozen major attacks, and God knows how many smaller attacks. So, and there hasn't been this big response. So
I mentioned this on a prior show rather, that I heard Henry Kissinger speak once, where he said, and this was around 2008 time, where he said that Crimea is like a strategic, one of the highest strategic important places on earth for Russia, because it's where their navy, it's their one water part for their navy, and that Obama shouldn't be held to too high of a not too much criticism should be put on him for letting Russia do what they did, basically, because this in the sweep of history, Crimea is so important for Russia. We ought to take note of it. The West needs to just kind of swallow it and take note of it. But since that moment, Putin has gotten engaged in a mythology that sort of erases Ukraine as an independent nation from history, and he's got this philosophy, this expansion, that Russian expansion, their sphere of influence. To a certain extent, it's not a rational it doesn't appear to be fully rational on Putin's side right now. So I don't know if a peace settlement is something that really we could expect in the short term, but in the long term, the world is preparing for Putin to get more dangerous, and so we'll speak more about that as winter rolls in and we see how tightly Russia is able to squeeze our European allies.
All right, well, that brings us to predictions. Dave, what have you got for us?
So this week I saw an article in The Hill published showing that there's a rift in the GOP, evidence that the GOP is in the midst of a strategic disagreement. And this is in part because it seems like they may in fact lose the ability to take the Senate back. Mm-hmm. Mitch McConnell has said, famously, if we lose, the quality of the candidates could be a primary reason. However, right now, things are looking so bad that they're already starting to do some finger pointing. And so Rick Scott finds himself as the sort of punching bag of public criticism. He's famously the guy who's the head of the Senate Congressional Committee to get them reelected. Plan to Rescue America was met with a lot of criticism because he said we're going to raise taxes on everybody. Their strategy was there's lots of public dirty laundry being aired, but at this point it seems like large donors are shying away from the controversial, underwhelming candidates. And without a bailout from McConnell's super PAC or from Trump himself, then these candidates are looking like they may in fact lose. This is highly unlikely they're going to get that bailout, and will have a negative effect on the GOP states, Georgia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, where money is just not forthcoming. And if this does play out as anticipated, it will be considered a disaster for Rick Scott and the campaign committee he chairs.
All right, I'm going to be very quick here. I'm calling another Senate race. Just looking at the polls and looking at the dynamics and what I consider to be the Dobbs effect, I am going to call Malcolm Davis at. I'm going to have to stop there. What's his last name? Sorry about that, Matt. You're going to have to edit that out. I am calling Wisconsin for Malcolm Barnes. That will be an upset of a longtime incumbent, Ron Johnson. We're 2 months away from the election, and I'm making that call. I'm not ready to make some other calls, but I am making that call because I just don't see Ron Johnson turning around unless there's some scandal or something that impacts Barnes. Anyways, we'll be talking about that in the future weeks. Yep. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.